So, too old to do that shit. Okay. The idea is like, why is this a transferase? Because people are talking about it like dealing with oxygen and all of that. And they're just kind of like trying to understand what the heck is going on here or whatever. And so the idea is that in the process of doing this, you're not actually doing anything with this oxygen or whatever. You're basically just doing something with this phosphate group. So the idea is that in the process of doing ADP to ATP, you're transferring that phosphate to that ATP or whatever. That's the most common one we think of, and this is done with kinases and phosphatases, right? Phosphatases. I still spell it wrong, doesn't matter. People don't pay me to spell.
We don't pay at all.
I know. Exactly it. Why am I not getting paid? So the idea is that we're not really touching this oxygen, and yeah, this oxygen has more bonds here, but all that really has to do with is the fact that oxygen itself likes to have bonds. So it started out with these two bonds here, and in the process of breaking this bond, you're actually taking these electrons here and pushing them to here. So what happens is kind of your intermediate is you have your PO3 over here, just because whenever it's bonding to your ADP or whatever, this has an extra oxygen on it, which makes this a PO4, but we don't care about that. But the idea is that you've got your PO3 separate, and then you've got this, which has your oxygen with an extra set of electrons, and then CO2 negative. And so what happens is that this oxygen really likes to have this extra set of bonds, so it will push these electrons down, which then form this structure, but this carbon now has 5 bonds, which it doesn't really like to do. So what it does is it forms this structure, and along the way, it'll just pick up a hydrogen to satisfy that. So what happens is you form, there's an intermediate here that I can draw. So you end up forming C, that, which gives that a negative, and then CO2 negative over here, because it's just hanging out. So then this hydrogen ion will bond with these electrons of carbon, which then gives us CH3 here. But he doesn't really care about us knowing all of this. He just wants you to understand that this is a transferase because you're removing that phosphate group. Does that make sense?
So just to be able to quickly identify this, I mean, do you have a method to kind of work through that?
Method to work through that is identify what's the same between these.
Right.
So if this oxygen was no longer there, if it just turned into something like this, or maybe even like a triple bond or something like that, that would be some sort of redox reaction because you're actually removing that oxygen.
Right. But because it stays,
Because
it's
it's
just a
staying,
transferase.
you just have to figure out what's going on with this double bond here. In terms of like with ATP, it's technically still sort of a redox reaction because you're changing the number of bonds on oxygen, but we're not really caring about the oxygen, we're caring about the phosphate group and this hydrogen. And so we're substituting things out in the way that makes this happen. And that's what transferases do, is they substitute. Bueno?